Florence, Kansas. October 1878. A passenger steps off a train into the cold prairie wind. He has been riding for 2 days. His back aches. His mouth tastes like coal smoke. He has eaten at 3 depot lunch counters since Kansas City, and every one of them has left him worse off than before. Stale bread, meat of uncertain origin, coffee that was made sometime yesterday and reheated until it tasted like something you'd use to strip paint. He walks into the Florence eating house expecting more of the same. White linen on every table, sterling silver laid in perfect order, a steak cut to weight arriving hot. Coffee poured from a fresh pot, clear and dark, in a porcelain cup without a chip on the rim. He sits down. He stares at the tablecloth. The man who made this possible died 42 years before most Americans had ever heard his name. He arrived in this country with almost nothing. He lost everything once and started over. He built the first restaurant chain in American history, hired tens of thousands of women to run it, commissioned buildings that still stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon, and helped invent an entire region of the country as a thing worth wanting. So, here is the question this story keeps asking. Was Fred Harvey a visionary who gave the American West something it desperately needed? Or was he a man who decided what the West should look and then sold it back to the people who already lived there? Which version you believe depends on where you're standing when you look. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Washed Dishes. Before we go any further, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I'm always curious who ends up watching a documentary about a man who fed half of America. Before the tablecloths, there was a boy scrubbing pots in Lower Manhattan. Frederick Henry Harvey was born in London, England, on June 27, 1835. His father was Scottish. His mother was English. The household was working class and not inclined toward sentiment about it. Harvey left school early. The exact age varies depending on the source, but he was in his early teens and found work in whatever capacity he could. At 17, he crossed the Atlantic. He arrived in New York City carrying what his immigration record suggests was close to nothing. No contacts, no family waiting, no arrangement of any kind beyond the reasonable certainty that New York had more kitchens than London, and that kitchens needed people willing to work. He got a job washing dishes at a cafe in Lower Manhattan. He was not there long before he was doing something more than washing dishes. He was watching. The way orders moved from table to kitchen and back again. The way a busy room could be controlled or lost by a single decision made in the wrong moment. The way customers reacted when the food was good versus when it was merely edible. These were not observations that most dishwashers were making. Harvey was making them anyway. He worked his way through New York's restaurant trade over several years. Then he moved south to New Orleans, where the food was better than anywhere else in the country, and where a man paying attention could learn things about flavor and presentation and service that no kitchen in Manhattan was yet teaching. Then he moved again to St. Louis, following whatever combination of opportunity and restlessness drove him. By the late 1850s, he was not washing dishes anymore. He had a business partner, a man named John Carson, and together they opened a restaurant in St. Louis. It was a real operation. Table service, decent food, the kind of place Harvey had been training himself to run for the better part of a decade. Then the Civil War came. The war destroyed the business the way it destroyed most things along the Missouri River corridor, suddenly and without particular regard for what the people involved had built. Supply chains collapsed. Customers disappeared into the army or into fear. And John Carson, Harvey's partner, vanished. Took the cash, left no explanation and no forwarding address. Harvey was in his late 20s. He had no business, no partner, and no money. Everything he had spent 10 years learning, he now had no platform to use. He did not leave St. Louis immediately. He held on for a while, taking odd jobs, trying to find a way back. But there was nothing to hold on to. Eventually, he moved to Leavenworth, Kansas, where he married a woman named Barbara Sarah Mattis in 1862. She went by Sally. She was steady in a way that Harvey, who never stopped moving, may have needed more than he knew. They would have 8 children together. 5 would live to adulthood. Harvey needed work. He found it on the railroad. The job was unglamorous. Mail clerk, then freight agent for the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad. He rode the route across northern Missouri between Hannibal on the Mississippi and St. Joseph on the Missouri River. He sat in coach cars and freight cars and ate at every depot lunch counter the route passed through. And that is where everything began to change. Not because the railroad job was interesting, but because the food was so consistently, so thoroughly, so almost impressively bad that a man who had spent 20 years thinking about what good food required could not stop noticing exactly what was wrong. What was wrong was almost everything, and he was going to fix it. He just needed someone willing to let him try. Chapter 2. The Education of a Railroad Man. The depot lunch counter was one of the great American con operations of the 19th century. The mechanics were simple. A passenger train stopped at a station for 20 to 30 minutes. Passengers had been riding for hours with nothing to eat. They were hungry, and they had no other option within 100 miles. They walked into the depot lunchroom, ordered whatever was available, and the counter operator collected their money, knowing full well that the food would arrive after the train whistle blew. That was not an accident. That was the business model. The counter operator served slowly by design. When the whistle sounded and the passengers ran for the platform, the food was returned to the kitchen and sold again to the next train's worth of captive diners. The coffee had been sitting since morning. The meat was reheated until whatever it had once been was no longer identifiable. The bread had been sliced the previous day and covered with a damp cloth to disguise the staleness. Flies were a constant presence. Ice was expensive and rarely used. On many routes, the counter operator had a financial arrangement with the train conductor. The conductor would give the whistle early if the counter was running a particularly profitable scheme that day. Fred Harvey ate this food for years. He documented what he saw. He was methodical about it in the way that people who have been wronged by a system often become methodical, cataloging grievances with the focus of someone who intends to eventually do something about them. The scale of what he was observing was significant. Millions of Americans were crossing the country by rail in the 1860s and 1870s. The Transcontinental Railroad had opened in 1869. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was pushing south and west through Kansas, into New Mexico territory, into Arizona, toward California. More routes meant more passengers. More passengers meant more depot counters. More depot counters meant more of the same rancid meat and reheated coffee, replicated across 2,000 miles of American prairie and desert. Harvey tried his first proposal with the Burlington Railroad in the early 1870s. The Burlington ran through the Midwest on a route Harvey knew well. He pitched them a concept. He would run the eating houses along their line. He would guarantee the food quality. He would take care of the staffing and the sourcing. All he needed was their agreement and their facilities. The Burlington passed. They did not see the problem he was describing as their problem to solve. Harvey went back to the freight work. He kept riding. He kept eating bad food and noting down what bad food costs. Not just in money, but in the story a railroad tells about itself every time a passenger sits down at one of its counters and gets something inedible for their trouble. In 1876, He walked into the offices of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. The AT and SF was a different kind of railroad from the Burlington. It ran through emptier country, the Kansas plains, the New Mexico high desert, the Arizona scrubland. Its passenger volume was lower. Its reputation for comfort was essentially non-existent. Nobody crossed on the AT and SF because it was pleasant. They crossed because it went where they needed to go. The man Harvey needed to convince was Charles F. Morse, the railway's general superintendent. Morse was practical, and he was listening. Harvey laid out the problem. Every eating house on the AT and SF route was a liability. Passengers arrived expecting nothing and received confirmation of their expectations. They told other passengers. The railroad's reputation for passenger comfort, which was already poor, got worse with every meal it did not control. Harvey told Morse he could fix it. Morse asked what he needed. Harvey told him. The buildings, the fuel, the ice, the freight on his supplies, delivered at no charge. He would handle everything else: staff, food, sourcing, standards, the full operation. He would take all the risk. The railroad would provide the infrastructure and collect the benefit of having passengers who arrived at their destinations without hating the company that had carried them. Morse said yes. There was no written contract. The two men shook hands, and with that handshake, in 1876, Frederick Henry Harvey got everything he needed and nothing he could guarantee would last. The first Harvey house opened at the Topeka Depot in February of 1876. White tablecloths, real silverware, coffee made fresh and served in porcelain, a menu with actual choices. Passengers walked in and stopped. Just stopped. Because nothing about it matched what they had been trained to expect. By 1878, the Florence Harvey House was open. A Kansas newspaper wrote that it served the best meal west of the Mississippi. That sentence traveled. People told other people. Other people bought tickets on the AT and SF, specifically to find out whether it was true. Harvey did not advertise. He did not need to. But running a restaurant where the food is consistently good requires something that is not on any menu. It requires a workforce. And the workforce Harvey was going to build is the part of the story that history almost always gets wrong. Where exactly do you find enough people, the right kind of people, willing to work in the middle of the Kansas prairie or the New Mexico desert day after day, to a standard that would satisfy a man who weighed the stakes personally? Harvey found an answer. It was in the classified sections of Midwestern newspapers, and it changed more lives than anyone who ran the ad anticipated. Chapter 3. The Handshake. Let the terms of what Harvey and Morse agreed to settle for a moment. The AT and SF would provide Harvey with the physical building at each stop along its route. It would supply the fuel to heat those buildings and keep the kitchens running. It would provide ice, expensive and logistically complicated in the 1870s, at no charge to Harvey. And it would carry Harvey's food supplies along its own freight line, free of cost, from Harvey's sourcing operations to his eating houses all the way down the route. Harvey, for his part, would run every operation himself: staff, menu, sourcing, quality, training, standards. Every dollar of revenue was his. Every operational mistake was his. Every inspection, every fired employee, every replaced kitchen, every steak that came back to the pass-through window at the wrong temperature, all of it was Harvey's problem. The railroad bore no cost and no risk. Harvey bore all of it. What made this arrangement work was not generosity on either side. It was alignment. The AT and SF needed passengers who would recommend the route to other passengers. Harvey needed a route with enough traffic to support eating houses in places no one would otherwise open a restaurant. The handshake bound two problems to a single solution. Harvey began building immediately. He did not renovate what already existed at depot counters. He replaced it entirely. New china, ordered in bulk and stamped with Harvey's name, silver-plated cutlery, inspected before each service, linen tablecloths, laundered on a schedule Harvey set himself. He specified the weight of a steak, 10 ounces, no more or less without reason, and the temperature at which coffee was to be served, and the exact angle at which a cup was to be placed on its saucer. The angle of a cup on a saucer. That is the level of detail he was working at in 1876 in the middle of Kansas, before anyone else in American food service was thinking about any of it. He showed up unannounced. That was the part his staff remembered most. Harvey traveled the route constantly, arriving at his own restaurants without warning, sitting down at a table like any other passenger, ordering the food, drinking the coffee, picking up the fork and turning it over to look at the tines. If the food was correct, he said nothing and left. If it was not, the consequences were immediate. In the early days of the New Mexico expansion, Harvey arrived at an Albuquerque location and found the kitchen operating below his standards. The coffee was weak. The meat had been held too long. He fired the entire kitchen staff on the spot. He then sent word up and down the line for replacements and had a functioning operation within 48 hours. No one who heard that story forgot it. It spread through the Harvey system the way useful stories do, because it communicated, more efficiently than any employee handbook, what the man actually cared about and what the cost of indifference would be. But there was a structural tension underneath the perfectionism that Harvey probably understood and never spoke about directly. He did not own the buildings. He did not own the route. He did not own the freight capacity that made his supply chain possible. Every physical asset the Harvey system depended on belonged to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, and the only thing standing between Harvey and the loss of everything he was building was the memory of a handshake between two men in 1876. For years this did not matter. The system worked. Passengers ate well. The railroad benefited. Harvey expanded. By 1887, he had 34 locations running across 13 states and territories. The AT and SF had no incentive to alter the arrangement. Harvey had no reason to force a formal contract. But the handshake was not a contract. It was a relationship. And relationships, unlike contracts, depend entirely on the continued goodwill of both parties. Harvey had spent his life watching what happens to businesses when goodwill disappears. He had watched his St. Louis restaurant vanish when his partner took the cash. He knew, better than most, that the most durable agreements are the ones nobody feels they need to escape. He made himself indispensable. That was the contract he chose to write, not on paper, in coffee and silverware and the weight of a steak at a depot in the middle of nowhere. For a while, it held. But Harvey knew that to hold it permanently, he needed something no level of quality control could fully supply. He needed a workforce so reliable, so visible, so embedded in the culture of the route that pulling the system apart would be unimaginable. He had already begun building that workforce. The ads were already running. The first women were already on the train, heading west toward jobs they had never quite been able to picture until the letters arrived. What they were walking into was unlike anything available to young women in American life at that moment. It was also unlike anything they had been told it would be. Chapter 4. The Girls. The ad ran in newspapers across the Midwest and the East. The wording changed slightly from paper to paper and year to year, but the core of it stayed the same. Young women, 18 to 30 years of age, of good moral character, attractive and intelligent, experience preferred but not required. must be unmarried. Apply to the Fred Harvey Company, Leavenworth, Kansas. The women who answered came from everywhere. From small farms in Ohio and Indiana, where the alternative was marrying the neighbor's son or working the family land until there was nothing left to work. From textile towns in Pennsylvania, where the mills paid almost nothing and took everything. From schoolhouses in Missouri and Illinois, where a woman with a teaching certificate earned less per month than a man doing the same job, sometimes half as much. From city boarding houses where the rent consumed whatever wages the week had produced. They wrote letters. They received letters back. They bought train tickets. What they were heading toward was not exactly what the ad described, and they would understand this quickly. The dormitory came first. Every Harvey house above a certain size had one attached to the building, usually on an upper floor or in an adjacent structure. A house mother ran it with the authority of someone who had been given the rules in writing and intended to follow them, regardless of how anyone felt about it. Curfew was 10 o'clock. No exceptions that the house mother had any record of honoring. Male visitors were not permitted above the ground floor. The door was locked at night. The uniform was black. Harvey had chosen the fabric partly for its appearance and entirely for its practicality. Black does not show stains the way white does, and a 12-hour shift in a working kitchen produces stains. The apron was white, starched, and changed at least twice per shift. The collar was white and detachable, pressed each morning before service. The overall effect was clean and legible from across a dining room, which was the point. A passenger who had just spent 48 hours on a train needed to be able to identify at a glance who was there to help them. The training lasted 2 weeks before a girl was allowed to work the floor unsupported. The table setting alone took days to learn. Harvey's specifications were not suggestions. The coffee cup sat in the saucer at an exact angle. The silverware was placed in a precise sequence. The water glass was positioned at a specific distance from the right hand. The napkin was folded in a single approved way. If any element was wrong, when the house manager walked the floor before service, it was corrected before the doors opened. This was not fussiness. This was the product. The entire value of a Harvey house to a passenger who had no other options was the assurance that what they received would be what they had been told to expect. Consistency was not a feature of the experience. It was the experience. And consistency required people who understood, who had actually internalized, that the details were not separable from the result. The women learned this faster than Harvey had expected. Several of his managers noted it in correspondence that survives. The girls were more reliable than the male staff they replaced in some locations, more attentive to the standards, less inclined to regard the rules as negotiable. 6-month contract, $18 a month, plus room, board, and tips. In the early years of the program, $18 a month was more than domestic service paid in most parts of the country, and domestic service came without room, board, or tips. For a woman from a farm in Indiana or a textile town in Pennsylvania, the math was not complicated. The marriage prohibition during the first year of service was real and enforced. After the first year, a girl could marry if she chose to, though marriage typically ended her employment. The company tracked marriages along the route the way it tracked inventory, carefully and with an eye toward what the numbers meant. The number that emerged over the course of the program's history is one that Fred Harvey is said to have repeated with considerable satisfaction. Approximately 5,000 Harvey girls married men they met while working along the AT and SF route. He said he had done more to populate the West than any other living American. The claim was self-serving. It was not wrong. What those marriages meant to the towns along the route is a story that does not appear in any company record. It survives in local histories. A Harvey house opened in a town, and within a few years, the women who had stayed after their contracts ended had started schools, organized churches, established reading circles, filled positions on school boards. They were educated, they were experienced in managing complex operations under difficult conditions, and they had chosen to be where they were. Towns that had been stopping points became communities. This was not Harvey's stated intention. It was the consequence of deploying tens of thousands of capable women across an underpopulated landscape and giving them reasons to stay. 20,000 women worked as Harvey Girls between the early 1880s and the middle of the 20th century. $18 a month plus room and board, 6-month renewable contracts, 47 restaurants, 15 hotels, and 30 dining cars operating at the time of Harvey's death, a number that would keep growing under his sons. More than 5,000 employees on payroll at any one time. 20 million meals served in a single year at the height of the system. 5,000 marriages across the route's history. One uniform, pressed and correct, changed on schedule, every shift, at every location, from Kansas to California. The operation was enormous, but it was only the part of what Harvey built that the passengers saw. Behind it, invisible to everyone who sat down at a Harvey table, was an industrial apparatus that made the whole thing possible. And understanding it requires going back to Kansas, to a farm, to the question of how, exactly, you serve a consistent steak in the middle of the Arizona desert in 1885. Chapter 5. The Empire of Tables. The steak started in Kansas. Harvey owned a farm in the eastern part of the state, not far from his Leavenworth base of operations. It was not a showpiece property. It was a working supply farm, vegetables, dairy, fresh produce, the kind of inventory that a restaurant chain operating across 2,000 miles of railroad line needed to maintain quality without depending on whatever happened to be available locally at each stop. In the 1880s, moving perishable food over long distances was not a solved problem. Ice was expensive. Refrigeration in transit barely existed as a practical technology. What Harvey did was apply the same logic he applied to everything else. Identify the specific obstacle, build the specific solution, and not wait for the industry to catch up. He invested in refrigerated rail cars. This was not a small expenditure. The technology was new and the infrastructure to support it was limited. But the alternative was accepting that the quality of his food would be determined by what each individual location could source locally, and local sourcing in New Mexico Territory or the Arizona desert in the 1880s was not going to produce the consistency the Harvey brand required. The refrigerated cars ran from his farm and from larger suppliers he contracted with, carrying fresh goods to his eating houses on the AT and SF's own freight line, which the railroad, per the arrangement that required no paper to remain valid, transported at no charge. In 1883, he took the next logical step. If the food could follow the passenger as far as the eating house, it could follow the passenger further. He negotiated with the AT and SF to introduce dining cars on the route. The first ones were not luxurious, they were functional, but they were Harvey's, which meant they were clean, and the coffee was fresh, and the food arrived at the correct temperature. A passenger on the AT and SF no longer had to disembark and gamble on 20 minutes in a depot lunchroom. The meal came to them. The dining car changed something fundamental about the journey. Not just the food, the experience of crossing the country. A passenger could now sit at a white-linened table, watch the desert scroll past the window, and eat a meal that would not have embarrassed a decent restaurant in Chicago. The West had been hostile and then merely vast, and then, with Harvey's intervention, navigable. That sequence mattered more than anyone in the 1880s had language to describe. His chefs were trained. His recipes were standardized. The same coffee formula was in use at every location from Topeka to Los Angeles, the same ratio, the same temperature, the same service, the same PIE. Harvey reportedly told his managers that the pie was not a menu item. It was a promise. A passenger who ordered pie at the eating house in Raton, New Mexico, had a right to expect the same thing when they ordered it in Needles, California. The pie was the measure of whether the system was working. This was not a small ambition. Managing food quality across a network that stretched more than 2,000 miles, staffed by thousands of employees who had been recruited from across the country and trained to a standard that most of them had never encountered before, required a degree of organizational discipline that American business had not yet developed a formal vocabulary for. Harvey did it through inspection, through standardization, through the very specific threat of consequences, and through the genuine conviction, which his staff sensed and in many cases shared, that the work mattered. He continued to travel the route. He continued to arrive without warning. The Albuquerque incident was not unique. There were others. The stories accumulated into a mythology around the man himself. A mythology that served a purpose, because a workforce that believes its standards are watched is a workforce that maintains them even when no one is watching. By the time Fred Harvey was in his 60s and the system was at scale, he was carrying the operation on the strength of a handshake, a farm in Kansas, a fleet of refrigerated rail cars, thousands of women in black and white uniforms, and a set of table-setting specifications that had not changed since 1876. He was also DIing. He knew it. And when a family member, near the end, raised the question of managing costs, cutting portions here, using cheaper ingredients there, reducing the specifications slightly to protect the margin, Harvey's answer was reportedly brief and unambiguous. "Don't cut the ham too thin, boys." He died on February 9th, 1901, in Leavenworth, Kansas. He was 65 years old. His estate was valued at approximately $1.7 million. His sons Ford and Byron inherited the operation. They inherited the instruction. And for the next several decades, they did not cut the ham thin. But there were things Harvey had set in motion that even he had not fully understood. One of them was happening at the Grand Canyon. A woman was standing at the canyon's rim with a sketchbook, studying the shape of the walls, and what she was going to build there would outlast every dining car and every standardized recipe and every rule about cup angles that Harvey had ever written down. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Built the Southwest. Mary Elizabeth Jane Colter was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1869. She grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. She studied art and design in San Francisco at what is now the San Francisco Art Institute, at a time when women studying architecture were told, sometimes directly, that architecture was not a field they should plan to enter. She entered it anyway. She taught architectural drawing in San Francisco for years because teaching was the available door, and she was going to be in the building whether they sold her a ticket or not. She was demanding in a way that her students tended to find either clarifying or crushing, depending on how much they cared about doing the work correctly. She had very little patience for approximation. She believed a detail was either right or it was wrong, and the difference between the two was not a matter of opinion. In 1902, the Fred Harvey Company hired her to design an Indian building at the Grand Canyon's south rim. The structure was called Hopi House. It would open in 1905, and it would serve two purposes simultaneously. It would sell Native American crafts to tourists, and it would give those tourists a building that gestured toward the architectural traditions of the people whose crafts were for sale inside it. Colter did not gesture. That was the first thing anyone who worked with her understood. Before she drew a single line for Hopi House, she spent months studying Hopi architecture, its specific geometries, the way it related to the landscape it sat in, the materials it used, and why. She visited Hopi villages. She looked at photographs and artifacts and ethnographic records with the focus of someone who understood that getting this wrong would be immediately visible to anyone who actually knew what right looked like. Hopi House was not an approximation of a Hopi village. It was a specific interpretation, built from genuine understanding, constructed from the same materials and following the same structural logic. It sat on the canyon's rim as though it had been there for a century before the tourists arrived. That was the effect she was always after. Not novelty, earned presence. She designed 8 landmark structures for the Harvey Company over the next 3 decades. Hermit's Rest, at the canyon's western end, built in 1914 to look as though a hermit had actually built it from whatever was at hand, rough stone, irregular openings, a fireplace that seemed to have grown from the rock rather than been placed there. The Lookout Studio, the same year, where she embedded actual ancient pottery shards into the mortar of the walls. Not replicas, originals. She sourced them deliberately because she wanted anyone who looked closely at the building to understand that this landscape had a history that preceded the railroad and the tourist trade and everything that was happening around the rim. The Desert View Watchtower, completed in 1932, was the fullest expression of what she had been working toward since Hopi House. It rose 70 feet from the canyon's eastern rim, designed to evoke the watchtowers of the ancient Southwest, Mesa Verde, Hovenweep, Chaco Canyon. She climbed scaffolding in her 60s to supervise every stone course. She commissioned a Hopi artist named Fred Harvey to paint the interior walls with kiva murals, traditional imagery executed by a man whose people had actually made such images in a building that was designed to hold them correctly. She called the result an honest building. That phrase meant something specific to her. An honest building did not pretend to be something it was not. It did not strain for effect or impose its own personality on a landscape that already had one. It earned its place by understanding the place first. Her masterpiece, she said herself, was La Posada. It opened in Winslow, Arizona in 1930, a sprawling hacienda on the high desert with hand-painted tiles and antique furniture and gardens laid out to blur the line between inside and outside. She said it was the finest thing she had ever done. She said this knowing that the railroad, which owned the building, was already beginning to regard it as an operational inconvenience rather than an architectural achievement. In the years after the Second World War, the Harvey Company began to contract. La Posada became office space. Colter's other buildings were looked at the way organizations look at things they would rather not spend money maintaining. When the question of demolition was raised regarding one of her structures, she reportedly said she was sorry she had not torn it down herself before they could get to it. She died in 1958. She was 88 years old. She had worked for the Harvey Company for 46 years, and in that time she had designed buildings that anyone can still visit at the Grand Canyon today, buildings that look as though they have always been there, which was entirely the point. She received no major professional recognition during her lifetime. She was not admitted to the American Institute of Architects. Her name was not in the architectural histories. It would take decades after her death for preservationists and historians to begin to understand the scale of what she had done. And what she had done was give Fred Harvey's empire its face, its image. The physical expression of the argument the Harvey Company and the railroad were making together, that the American Southwest was not an obstacle to be crossed, but a destination worth the journey. That argument had been running in print for years before Colter built anything. and the machinery behind it was bigger than any single building she ever designed. Chapter 7: Inventing the Southwest. At some point in the first decade of the 20th century, wealthy Americans stopped apologizing for not going to Europe. This was not an accident. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company had decided together that the Grand Canyon and the New Mexico high desert and the Red Rock country of Arizona were not consolation prizes for people who could not afford the Alps. They were better than the Alps. They were more dramatic, more ancient, more genuinely strange, and they were American. What followed was the most ambitious regional marketing campaign the country had ever attempted. The ATNSF began commissioning paintings in the 1890s. Not illustrations for brochures, actual paintings from actual artists made in front of actual landscapes. Thomas Moran had already spent years in the West. His canvases of Yellowstone had helped convince Congress to establish the first national park. The railroad found him and sent him to the Grand Canyon and paid him for the right to reproduce his work. The resulting images appeared on everything the company produced: timetables, calendars, promotional folders, the covers of illustrated magazines. By 1910, a Moran painting of the Grand Canyon was more widely reproduced than almost any other image of a natural landscape in American history. Moran was not alone. Maynard Dixon painted the desert light of New Mexico and Arizona with a precision that made the landscape look both ancient and alive. E. Irving Coues painted Taos Pueblo. W. Herbert Dunton painted the Rio Grande Valley. The railroad contracted with the Taos Society of Artists, a colony of painters who had settled in northern New Mexico and whose work gave the Southwest a visual vocabulary: red adobe walls against blue sky, the geometry of kiva ladders, the particular quality of afternoon light at altitude that it has never fully shed. These images traveled. They went to schools and libraries and travel agencies. They appeared on the walls of waiting rooms in cities that had never sent a passenger to New Mexico. They were reproduced in lantern slide lectures, the equivalent of video presentations in an era before film was everywhere, that were given at civic organizations, churches, and universities across the East and the Midwest. The lecture circuit was extensive. Tens of thousands of Americans who had never left Ohio or Pennsylvania sat in darkened halls and watched colored images of canyon walls and desert sunsets and Pueblo villages projected onto screens, while a narrator explained that all of this was a train ticket away. The campaign had a slogan: "See America First." It was aimed explicitly at the class of Americans who had been booking passage to Liverpool and spending their money in Europe, and it made an argument that was equal parts patriotic and practical. The American West, the argument went, was as spectacular as anything the Old World offered. It was closer, and the journey itself on the ATNSF with Harvey's food in the dining car was civilized rather than merely endured. The argument worked. Grand Canyon visitation was somewhere around 30,000 visitors annually at the turn of the century. By 1929, that number had grown to more than 200,000. The jump was not primarily because the canyon had improved. It was because an industrial effort to make people want to go there had succeeded. What Harvey's role in this was, specifically, was the infrastructure of desire. You could tell 1,000 people that the Grand Canyon was worth seeing, but if they had to spend 3 days eating rancid food at depot lunch counters to get there, some percentage of them were going to decide it was not quite worth it. Harvey had removed that objection. The journey on the AT&SF was edible, then comfortable, and then, with the dining cars and the new hotels at the canyon's rim, genuinely pleasant. The obstacle between wanting to go and actually going had been cleared. The Harvey hotels at the canyon did not simply serve the tourist trade, they shaped it. El Torvar, which opened on the South Rim in 1905, was the most remote luxury hotel in the country, a Swiss chalet crossed with a Norwegian villa, perched at the edge of a mile-deep canyon in the Arizona desert. The incongruity was deliberate. It told the passenger something specific. You have come a long way, and the place you have arrived at is worth what you paid to get here. Mary Colter's buildings around El Torvar said something different and more complicated. They said the landscape you are looking at has a history that the railroad did not create, that the people who lived in this country before the tourists arrived left something behind, that if you look carefully at the walls of this building, you will find the evidence. Both messages were real. Both were also instruments of an argument that was ultimately commercial. Come to the Southwest. We have made it worth your while. But something was missing from the paintings and the lantern slides and the hotel lobbies and the souvenirs. Something that the campaign's architects understood would make the experience feel not merely comfortable, but genuinely authentic. They needed the people. The actual people who had been in this landscape for centuries before the railroad arrived. And what the Harvey Company did to solve that problem is the part of this story that is the hardest to hold in a single hand. Chapter 8: The Authentic and the Sold. The Harvey Company Curio Room was a particular kind of American space. Small, usually, off the main dining room or set just inside the hotel lobby, where a passenger coming in from the train platform would encounter it before they had even found their table. Glass cases along the walls, shelves behind them. On the shelves, rugs folded in stacks, their geometric patterns compressed into tight rectangles. Pottery in earth tones, hand-formed and fire-blackened. The surfaces painted with designs that had specific meanings in the communities that had made them. Silver jewelry, rings and bracelets and pendants set with turquoise that had come out of New Mexico and Arizona ground that had yielded that particular stone for longer than anyone's written record. Harvey had curio shops attached to his properties across New Mexico and Arizona by the early 1900s. The business relationship was straightforward in its structure. Harvey bought from native producers and sold to tourists passing through on AT and SF trains. Navajo weavers, Hopi potters, Zuni silversmiths, and Pueblo jewelry makers found in Harvey a buyer with a distribution network that no individual craftsperson operating from a reservation in the Arizona desert could have built independently. The economic benefit was real. Many Navajo weaving families built genuine stability through the Harvey market. Hopi potters who could not otherwise move their work found in Harvey's curio shops a channel to buyers they would never have reached directly. The relationship was not charity, it was commerce. And for communities on land that the federal government had confined them to, with few other commercial outlets available, it was significant commerce. But Harvey imposed standards. This is what Harvey had always done, and the craft market was no exception. Rugs had to meet specifications for size, regularity of pattern, and finish. Pottery had to be complete and cleanly executed. Silver work had to be consistent and durable. The requirements were not arbitrary. They reflected what Harvey's tourist customers would and would not accept, but they were Harvey's requirements, not the producers. And over time, the market shaped the product. Designs that sold through Harvey channels got replicated. Dimensions that Harvey could display effectively in his cases became the default dimensions. The commercial relationship did not preserve traditional craft in amber. It redirected it toward what a buyer in Chicago or Kansas City would recognize as authentic and be willing to pay for. This was the first layer of the transaction. The second layer was the demonstrators. At Harvey's Grand Canyon properties, Hopi women wove in the lobbies. They sat at their looms in view of the guests, making actual cloth in the traditional manner, using the skills that their community had developed across generations, while tourists watched and often photographed them. The act of making, which in its original context was functional, communal, and private, became a scheduled attraction, something that appeared in Harvey's promotional materials as evidence of the genuine cultural experience available to the visitor who made the journey. The women were paid for their time, the arrangement was voluntary, and the presence of a living Hopi weaver in a building that Mary Colter had designed to evoke Hopi architectural tradition was, depending on who you were and where you were standing, a form of respect or a form of display, or both simultaneously in a combination that neither the company nor the weavers had language to fully negotiate at the time. In 1926, the Harvey Company and the railroad went further. They called it the Indian Detours. A passenger on the AT and SF could step off the train at designated stops in New Mexico and Arizona and board an open-air motor coach. The coaches were driven by women the company called couriers. The couriers were college-educated, recruited largely from Eastern universities, and trained in the archaeology, anthropology, and indigenous history of the Southwest to a depth that Harvey's regular staff were not required to match. They wore uniforms designed specifically for the program, concho belts of hammered silver, turquoise pieces at the throat and wrist, clothing that borrowed its palette and its spirit from Navajo and Pueblo aesthetics. The effect was of a guide who belonged to the landscape she was interpreting. The couriers drove their passengers to Taos Pueblo, where people had lived continuously for more than 1,000 years, to Bandelier, where ancient dwellings cut into the pale volcanic cliffs of the Jemez Mountains had stood empty since before Columbus, to Acoma, high on its mesa above the New Mexico plain, inhabited without interruption for 9 centuries, to spaces that were not ruins at all but active, present, inhabited, where the people whose ancestors had built those places still conducted ceremonies and maintained lives that the Detours program was selling access to. An AT and SF promotional pamphlet from the period invited passengers to come see the Indian Southwest while it remained. The phrase appeared in Harvey and railroad materials repeatedly through the 20s. Come see it, before it is gone. The irony embedded in that sentence is not subtle. The program's commercial value depended entirely on the culture it described as disappearing. If native communities in the Southwest actually vanished, the Detours program ceased to have anything to offer. The Harvey Company and the railroad, therefore, had a financial interest, genuine and structural, in the survival of the very cultures their marketing described as being on the edge of extinction. Whether this made them unlikely allies in cultural preservation or simply businesses protecting their inventory is a question historians have circled for decades without settling. The communities involved gave different answers at different times. Some welcomed the income. Some resented the access. Some made distinctions between what they were willing to show and what they were not. The couriers, trained in 3 languages and the archaeology of 4 major indigenous cultures, were navigating these boundaries in real time, on every tour, with no formal protocol for what to do when the boundary moved. 1926, Indian Detours operating across New Mexico and Arizona. More than 100 scheduled routes within a decade of the program's founding. 4 to 8 passengers per motor coach per trip. Couriers who could conduct a tour in English, Spanish, or one of the regional indigenous languages, depending on who was listening. Harvey curio operations existed at more than 30 locations. Thousands of Navajo rugs moved through Harvey channels annually by the mid-1920s. A market for native-made work that had not existed in any organized form 50 years earlier was now embedded in the purchasing habits of American tourists from coast to coast. The transaction generated income, and it also generated images. Photographs of Hopi weavers in hotel lobbies, Pueblo villages seen from motor coach windows, and Navajo silverwork in glass cases circulated through the same promotional channels as Thomas Moran's canyon paintings. They became part of the visual vocabulary of the American Southwest, a vocabulary that tourists brought home with them in the form of rugs, jewelry, and pottery, and that shaped, across the following century, what Americans thought the Southwest was. Fred Harvey had been dead for 25 years by the time the detours launched. His sons were making these decisions, and what they had inherited from their father was considerably more complex than a set of table-setting specifications. Chapter 9. What the Sons Carried. Fred Harvey stepped into his father's role at 35 years old, and the first thing he did was refuse to change anything. This was not timidity. Ford understood the Harvey system with the precision of someone who had watched it built from the inside. He knew that the standards were not separable from the name, that without the linen and the training and the inspections and the weight of a stake, the Harvey house was simply a room with tables in it. Any operation could have a room with tables. The whole point was what happened inside it. What Ford added was architectural ambition. He formalized the relationship with Mary Colter, who had been brought in just after his father's death to design Hopi House at the Grand Canyon. In the years that followed, Ford gave Colter latitude that most clients would not give an architect, the latitude to spend months on research before producing a single drawing, to insist on building materials that were expensive and logistically difficult, to embed actual artifacts into structures rather than decorative approximations of them. He understood, as his father had understood about food, that the thing people noticed was not the cost of the decision, but the consequence of it. A Colter building was unmistakably correct in a way that a cheaper building was not, and passengers who stayed at El Tovar and hiked to Herm's Rest and stood inside Hopi House could feel the difference without being able to name it. He also had to manage the Indian detours, which launched in the last years of his tenure, and which required a cultural degree of negotiation that no menu specification could cover. The program generated significant revenue. It also generated the kind of attention from anthropologists, from advocates for native communities, from journalists who had started asking what exactly was being sold and to whom, that his father's operation had never attracted. Food was unambiguous. A clean steak and fresh coffee did not raise questions about who owned the culture being served. The detours did. Ford navigated those questions the way he navigated most things, by focusing on what the operation was delivering and not spending much energy on the philosophical dimensions. He died in 1928. He was 61 years old. The company passed to his brother Byron, and then to Byron's son, and the Harvey name continued forward through family management in a way that Fred Harvey, who had always understood that handshakes were more fragile than they felt in the moment, would have found reassuring. What Ford had not lived to see was what arrived the following year. The Great Depression did not destroy the Harvey system, but it tested something that no inspection could measure. Whether the sons would honor the instruction when honoring it cost more than it would have cost to abandon it. Harvey hotels in the early 1930s were operating in an economy that had lost a third of its output in 3 years. Passenger rail travel dropped, tourism dropped, revenue dropped. Every margin in the operation came under pressure, and the easiest pressure to relieve was always the one you could not see directly: the freshness of the coffee, the weight of a steak, the quality of a pie. The sons did not cut the pie. They held the specifications. They absorbed the margin loss rather than dilute the product. There is a financial case to be made that this was the wrong decision. There is an equally strong case that it was the only decision because the Harvey name had survived a half-century on the premise that what the customer received would match what the customer had been promised. The moment that premise failed, the name was worth nothing, and the name was the only asset the family owned outright. The Depression passed, travel recovered, the system continued. But something was changing on the American road that had nothing to do with the economy. It was slower and more structural, and once it reached a certain point, completely irreversible. The first federal highway had been designated in 1926, the same year the detours launched. The automobile was not yet a practical alternative to the train for most long-distance American travel, but it was becoming one, and the infrastructure being built to support it was designed at a fundamental level to make what Harvey had built unnecessary. Harvey's system had survived by making itself indispensable. The highway was building an alternative, and the Harvey Company, which had always understood that survival required becoming whatever the moment demanded, was about to discover that some moments demand more than any company can become. It would take 20 years for the full weight of this to arrive. In the meantime, something else happened, something that ensured the Harvey name would survive even after the last Harvey house had closed its doors. A woman in a black-and-white uniform stepped onto a Hollywood soundstage, and the version of the Harvey story that 40 million Americans would eventually believe walked out to meet the cameras. Chapter 10. The Garland Version. In January of 1945, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer began filming a musical called The Harvey Girls. The project had been in development for 2 years, conceived originally as a dramatic vehicle for Lana Turner before producer Arthur Freed transformed it into a Technicolor showcase for Judy Garland. The film starred Judy Garland, who was at the midpoint of her Hollywood career and at the highest of her particular ability to make an audience believe, for the duration of a song, that the thing happening on screen was the only thing in the world. The film also starred John Hodiak, Angela Lansbury, and Ray Bolger, and it was directed by George Sidney, and it had a budget of several $1 million and a story that had been adapted from a novel that had itself taken significant liberties with the historical record. The plot was simple. A group of Harvey girls arrive in a rough frontier town. The town has a saloon. The saloon does not want the Harvey girls. The Harvey girls prevail. The West is civilized. Someone falls in love. The end. The film won the Academy Award for Best Original Song for a number called On the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. The song is about a train arriving and people being glad to see it. It is a good song. It bears very little relationship to what it was like to actually work for the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railway, or to serve meals in a Harvey house, or to live in a dormitory with a 10 o'clock curfew 700 miles from home. The Harvey Girls was released in 1946 and seen by approximately 40 million Americans. It was, for the generation that watched it, the definitive account of what a Harvey girl was, where she had come from, what she had done, and what it had meant. What it meant, in the film's version, was women from the East brought civilization to a violent frontier and defeated the forces of disorder through virtue and determination and a willingness to serve decent food. This was not entirely wrong. It was mostly incomplete. The film contained no dormitory rules, no marriage prohibition, no house mother with a locked door at 10 o'clock, no detail of how the supply chain from a Kansas farm to an Arizona desert eating house had been organized and maintained across 2,000 miles. No Mary Colter, though Colter was alive and working when the film was made, she would continue working for the Harvey Company for nearly a decade after the film's release. No Fred Cabote, no Hopi demonstrators in hotel lobbies, no motor coaches crossing New Mexico with couriers in silver concho belts. No question of what it meant to sell access to a living culture as a tourist product. No question at all, of any kind, about what was actually being sold, and to whom, and at whose expense. Fred Harvey himself appeared in the film. He had lines. He was played as a benevolent patriarch, a man whose primary function was to be right about bringing the girls west, and to be warmly vindicated when they succeeded. The specific quality that had defined Harvey in his actual life, the unannounced inspection, the immediate consequence, the conviction that mediocrity was a choice and the choice was unacceptable, does not appear in the film. The man in the film is comfortable. The man in history was not. The irony that anyone familiar with the Harvey story will feel when thinking about the film is this. The most widely seen version of the Harvey Girls' history is the version most distant from what actually happened. And yet the film's existence is the reason the Harvey name survived at all in popular culture. Without the Harvey Girls, Fred Harvey would today be known only to historians and railroad enthusiasts. The film gave him 40 million witnesses. The fact that the witnesses were shown something simplified does not change the fact that they remembered. There is a further irony, quieter and more uncomfortable. The film was released in 1946. By 1946, the Harvey system was already in the early stages of a contraction that would end it entirely within a generation. The highway had been building for 20 years. Commercial aviation was expanding rapidly in the post-war economy. The AT&SF was beginning to recalculate what passenger rail was worth maintaining. The Harvey houses that the film was celebrating were starting, house by house, to close. 40 million people watched a musical about a system that was quietly being dismantled while they watched it. The celebration and the ending arrived at almost the same moment. Chapter 11. The Slow Evacuation. It did not happen all at once. That is the hard part to hold on to when you look at what happened to the Harvey system after the war. The Interstate Highway Program was authorized by Congress in 1956. The logic behind it was military and commercial and political, and none of those rationales had anything to do with Fred Harvey. The highways would allow troops to move across the country in the event of war. They would allow commerce to move more efficiently. They would allow ordinary Americans to drive wherever they wanted to go, on their own schedule, without buying a ticket or sitting in a dining car or arriving at a depot and hoping the eating house was still open. The automobile had been growing as a practical mode of long-distance travel since the 1920s. The highway system made it definitive. A traveler crossing from Kansas to California in the 1950s had options that had not existed in the same form 10 years earlier. A motel beside the highway, a roadside diner, a gas station that sold food of the kind that nobody was going to write about in a Kansas newspaper. The food was not good. It was available on demand at any hour without a schedule. Harvey's system had been built around the schedule. The train arrived. The passengers had 20 minutes. The food had to be ready. The table had to be set. The coffee had to be in the cup. The schedule was not an inconvenience built into the Harvey experience. It was the condition that had made the Harvey experience possible. Remove the schedule, and what remained was a room with tables. The dining cars went first, route by route, as the AT&SF began to assess what passenger rail was worth subsidizing in a country that was falling in love with the highway. Then the eating houses. A Harvey house in a town whose train traffic had dropped below a sustainable threshold would close, and the building would sit for a while And then the building would come down, and a parking lot or a fast food franchise would occupy the footprint where a white linened table had once held a cup at a specific angle in a specific saucer. Commercial aviation accelerated the process. A passenger who in 1940 could afford a train ticket across the country could in 1955 afford an airplane ticket that covered the same distance in a fraction of the time. The journey that Harvey had made bearable and then comfortable and then genuinely pleasant was being replaced by a journey designed to be as short as possible. Comfort in transit was no longer the point. Speed was the point. The Harvey Company was sold in 1968 to Amfac Corporation, a Hawaii-based hospitality conglomerate, for a sum the company did not disclose. The relationship that had begun with a handshake in 1876 ended with a transaction in a boardroom 92 years later. The sons and grandsons of the man who had built the operation were no longer running it. A corporation that had never laid a mile of track now owned what was left of what he had built. The last Harvey House restaurant was closed in 1969. There was no ceremony. The sign came down, the door locked. The building stood for a while, or it did not. 92 years of independent operation ended. The last restaurant closed in 1969. La Posada, Colter's masterpiece in Winslow, Arizona, was converted to railroad offices in the post-war years and allowed to deteriorate until the question of demolition was raised. It sat essentially vacant for nearly 4 decades. Dozens of Harvey houses were demolished between 1950 and 1980. The buildings that replaced them were not designed to make anyone stop. The loss was not only the buildings. It was a pace. Harvey's system had been built on the premise that traveling across the American West was worth doing slowly, worth doing with attention, worth doing in the presence of good food and clean linen and a view of the desert through a dining car window. The highway and the airplane did not disprove this premise. They simply made it irrelevant to the economics of moving people from one place to another. But the Southwest that Harvey had helped to construct, the visual vocabulary, the aesthetic identity, the sense that this particular landscape was beautiful and ancient and worth seeing, did not disappear when the Harvey houses closed. It had been detached from the infrastructure that created it. It was loose in the culture now, available to anyone who had ever seen a Thomas Moran print on a classroom wall, or bought a Navajo rug at a trading post, or visited the Grand Canyon and stood at the rim of something so large that the only reasonable response was to be quiet. The Harvey Company was gone. The Southwest it had invented was not. And that raises the question this story has been building toward since a passenger sat down at a white linen table in Florence, Kansas in 1878 and stared at a tablecloth and could not quite understand what he was looking at. Chapter 12. The Mirror. Go back to Florence. October 1878. The passenger is still sitting at the table. He has not yet touched the food. He is looking at the tablecloth, clean and white and pressed flat, and entirely improbable in a depot-eating house in the middle of the Kansas prairie, and he is trying to understand what it means that this exists. It does not mean that a good man had a good idea. That is the simple version, and the simple version is insufficient. It means that a 17-year-old immigrant who arrived in New York with nothing had spent 30 years observing, with increasing precision, what made a meal worth having and what made a journey worth taking, and that he had found, in a railroad superintendent with a practical problem and a willingness to shake hands, the one opportunity that made those 30 years useful, and that he had built, on the strength of a handshake and a set of specifications that never changed, and a workforce that history almost entirely forgot, the first restaurant chain in American history. Fred Harvey was a visionary. He saw a problem that millions of Americans experienced daily, and that nobody in the food industry had yet decided was worth solving. He understood that consistency was not a feature of good service, it was the definition of it. He believed that the West could be made habitable not by conquest, but by comfort, and he spent his life proving it. He was also a man who built an empire on land he did not own, in buildings the railroad controlled, along a route whose traffic he could not guarantee. The structural dependency was always there. He managed it through indispensability rather than ownership, and it worked until the thing he had made himself indispensable to no longer needed him. The Harvey Girls were 20,000 women who answered a newspaper ad, got on a train, and discovered things they had not been fully told about, such as curfews, dormitory rules, marriage prohibitions, and a house mother who locked the door at 10. At the same time, they experienced something genuinely unprecedented for American women of their era. Wages they controlled, skills that had market value, and a landscape that was willing, in many cases, to become a home if they chose to stay. They were both an institution and an opportunity. History often highlights one aspect, but both were real. Mary Colter worked for 46 years for a company that nearly demolished her masterpieces and gave her no formal recognition during her lifetime. She designed buildings that tourists photograph every day without knowing her name, at the edge of one of the most visited natural landmarks on Earth. She spent months learning the architecture of peoples whose traditions she had no claim to, and she built from that learning with a seriousness that few of her contemporaries matched. She was not right about everything, but she was right about more than anyone acknowledged while she was alive to hear it. The native artisans who wove rugs to the specifications Harvey required, who sat at looms in hotel lobbies while tourists photographed them, and who guided couriers to their villages and watched their ceremonial spaces become tour stops, received economic benefit that was real and lost something that does not have a clean name, the control of how a culture is presented to the world, the difference between choosing to share something and having it purchased. The market Harvey created for their work persists, but the context that work carried before it entered a glass case does not always travel with it. Ford Harvey held the standards when holding them was expensive, and died before he could watch what the highway would do to everything his father had built. His grandsons carried the name forward until a Hawaii-based corporation bought it outright, and the system that had run on a handshake for nearly a century ended in a boardroom transaction that nobody wrote about in a Kansas newspaper. And what remains? Turquoise jewelry in the window of a Santa Fe shop, an adobe wall catching the afternoon light in a way that feels ancient even when the building is 10 years old. A Navajo textile on the living room floor of a house in Connecticut, bought on a trip west, carried home. The Grand Canyon, which needs no marketing and gets it anyway. The idea, durable and persistent and largely invisible to the people who hold it, that the American Southwest is a place of particular beauty and particular meaning, a place worth traveling to, a place that rewards the kind of attention that only a slow journey can produce. That idea did not exist in its current form before the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company decided to manufacture it. The landscape existed. The people existed. The light was the same light, but the decision that it was beautiful, the specific, transferable, commercially reproducible version of that decision was made in a marketing department and a painter's studio and a dining car and a curio shop, and then distributed across the country through the same channels Harvey used to distribute his coffee. The passenger in Florence is still sitting at the table. He is about to eat one of the best meals he has ever had west of the Mississippi. He does not know that the man who made it possible will be largely forgotten within a generation of his death. He does not know that the buildings being designed for the canyon's rim will outlast every dining car and every dormitory rule and every standardized recipe. He does not know that 40 million people will one day see a version of this story set to music and walk away with most of the important parts edited out. He just knows that the tablecloth is clean, the coffee is hot, the cup is in the right place on the saucer, and in a country where those things were never guaranteed, that was not a small achievement. It was, in its way, a form of argument. An argument that the West was worth inhabiting with care, that the journey mattered, that the people making it deserved more than what they had been given before Fred Harvey decided to give them something better. Was it a visionary who civilized the West? Or a man who sold the West a version of itself it was never quite meant to be? A Harvey girl who left a Pennsylvania textile town at 19, spent 6 months in New Mexico, and stayed for 40 years, answers that differently than the Hopi weaver who sat at a loom in a hotel lobby for a wage while a tourist from Pittsburgh photographed her without asking. The passenger in Florence answers it differently than the Navajo family whose rug is now on a floor in Connecticut. The answer is not hidden. It changes depending on where you are standing when you look, and most of us have only ever stood in one place. The tablecloth is clean, the coffee is hot, the cup is in the right place on the saucer. Decide for yourself what that cost, and if you have made it to the end of this, if you sat with this story through all of it, then you have spent more time with Fred Harvey than most Americans will ever spend, and more time than he probably would have asked for. He would have preferred you try the coffee. If you want to keep exploring the hidden stories behind the American West, subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and drop a comment. I want to know, which Harvey House location would you most want to see restored, or which Mary Colter building you think deserves a full documentary of its own? Some of those buildings are still standing. Some of them need more people to know their names. The comment section is a good place to start.